Riker shouted over the crackle, "Nobody touch him!" LaForge shoved against the first officer. "It's killing him!" Riker had to twist around and grab him in order to hold him off. The navigator continued to push his way towards Data, his hands biting into Riker's arm, but Riker simply refused to let him through.
Sorry, I'm going to read off my phone for a second because I have the script on here. Star Trek is an American science fiction television series created by Gene Roddenberry that first aired in 1966 to 1969. In 1979, Pocket Books, a division of Simon & Schuster Publishing Company, began publishing companion books for the Star Trek series, as well as other television series. The idea being multiple authors taking a crack at the iconic characters and concepts of Star Trek with the occasional episode or film adaptation. Like the first book published in TOS was an adaptation of the motion picture, written by Roddenberry himself. With this outline, multiple books would be published every year and create a very big catalog for Star Trek fans. Like me. So we're not talking about TOS here, we're talking about TNG. Star Trek the Original Series versus Star Trek The Next Generation. Star Trek The Next Generation, or TNG, ran from 1987 to 1994 and spawned 4 films as well as a direct sister TV series, Deep Space Nine, a show we will not be talking about here. Maybe I'll review the books later, there's not that many. So, Pocket Books started with their next-gen books in 1988, the same time as their other TOS Pocket Books were still being released. So, Pocket Books started their next-gen books in 1988, the same time as TOS Pocket Books were still being released, as well as overlapping with the actual next-gen show. Note: these books are supplemental to the show, but are not canon. There is some continuity between the books, and I will go over that through these subsequent videos about said books. Hello, I am Kay. A little bit about me is that I am a Star Trek fan. I got into Star Trek The Next Generation in 2021 when I was living with my boyfriend, right when COVID was happening, and I kind of got obsessed with it.
Shit, these Betazoid sluts can't keep off him! He can't get away! He can't be left to his own devices! These Betazoids are coming for Riker! God damn it, I knew it! I fucking knew she'd do this! I knew she would! Oh my god! I know how you...
So after I finished the series, I really was craving more content, so I found out about these books, and I started collecting them. So I decided I wanted to share my thoughts on them in some sort of video essay form, so here we are, and I hope you like these videos. At the time of me writing this and recording this, I have read about 9 books. Some of these books in the series are numbered, some of them are adaptations, and other ones are just kind of one-off stories that aren't numbered, but some of them are referenced by the numbered books, so it's a little confusing that they're not explicitly stated where they take place within the continuity of these books. So I will hopefully review each book numbered, and then sprinkled in there I will review the one-off books where they seem to make sense within the numbered ones, if that makes sense. Okay, so a little bit of background about the author of this book, Diane Carey. So Diane Carey has written books for TOS, TNG, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, and she may be the author of all of the Star Trek authors to have written the most books. She's also written other things outside of Star Trek, mostly romance, but who cares about that? We're talking about Star Trek here. So this book came out in 1988, but I believe it was written in 1987 while the first season was still airing. This is an assumption, but I believe all the authors were given some sort of Bible to help them write the characters and the scenarios for the books. Okay, so note. While I was writing this, I got this from eBay. So thank you, Michael, for the book. This is a writer's guide for the first season of TNG. So there's a bunch of notes and information here about how to write the characters and the scenarios for the first season. So I believe this, or a variant of this, may have been given to the authors, specifically Diane Carey, for this book. There's some information in here that I will go into later that correlate directly with this book, so I think it's a pretty safe assumption. Okay, just also another quick note. So we all know that season 1 of TNG was not the most polished of the show. It did not have, I think, the characters fleshed out very well yet, and they were still figuring out their footing. So the characters and the interactions and the personalities in this book kind of reflect that. Didn't really know who they were yet or what their personalities were, how they were interacting. Just some things that totally are in line with the series from this bad boy. But I'll get into the weird discrepancies later in the video. But just keep in mind when I go through the summary, there may be some weird things in there. So we'll get on with it. Spoilers ahead. If you, for any reason, want to pick up this book, now that you've heard me talk about it a little bit, stop now, because I'm going to tell you the whole book. If you would like to read this online, there is a copy of Ghost Ship on Digital Archive for purchase. Otherwise, though, I was able to pick this up at a secondhand bookstore in Half Price Books in Cincinnati, Ohio. I imagine that there are other secondhand bookstores that might have these. I was able to pick up a few other ones at random bookstores, so you should be able to find this pretty easily on eBay as well. So with that out of the way, we can finally begin the video. Okay, once again, reading off the script just for a second. The plot mostly follows, in no particular order, Counselor Deanna Troi, First Officer William Riker, Lieutenant Commander Data, Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge, and all the other characters are still involved as well. Jean-Luc Picard, Worf, Tasha Yar, Beverly Crusher, Wesley Crusher. There's an A-plot about the main antagonist that includes all of the characters, but there's also a B-plot that mostly revolves around Data, Riker, and Geordi, which is very interesting. Ghost Ship takes place a little bit after Encounter at Farpoint. There is a line in the book that states exactly when, but I couldn't find it. I would say it's probably about a month later. They reference that the characters are still getting to know each other and are not quite sure how to interact with each other just yet. The story begins when Deanna has a nightmare of a 20th century Russian aircraft carrier being absorbed by some sort of unknown electrical entity which disturbs her and kind of puts her in a funk. The ship is running tests on a gas giant requested by Starfleet. The ship is still brand new and it seems like the Federation is still checking out the capabilities of the Enterprise before it truly starts its voyage. Suddenly, Worf sees an energy reading across his screen, but it disappears just as quickly as it came. Deanna finally arrives on the bridge, but is quickly dismissed after Picard realizes how weird she is. Riker follows shortly after, but Tasha finds another energy reading outside the ship, but it's gone just as quickly once again. In Deanna's room, she's looking through historical records trying to find the exact airship carrier that she saw in her dream when Riker comes in, and they have a very sweet conversation, kind of alluding to their feelings for each other, very season 1. As Riker leaves her quarters, though, he sees the apparition of a man in the hallway. At the same time, Tasha Yar finds an energy reading within the ship. Deanna and Riker tell Picard what they just saw, and the team moves to the ready room. Together they look up the ship that Deanna saw in her dream, and they're able to find the exact model. Tasha Yar recognizes the ship's crew and the name of the ship as Russian. They eventually track down the full details of the ship, finding that the ship was a nuclear aircraft carrier that was found mangled and destroyed in 1995 with all of the crew missing. The team moves back to the bridge and Geordi has an outburst. He can suddenly see people appearing all through his visor, many humanoid specters walking all across the room, disturbing the crew. And again, they suddenly disappear. The crew is baffled by this, and they discuss the possibility of ghosts.
The starfield blurred before them, sizzled and reformed into a new pattern, and suddenly the bridge was walled with a gigantic glassy false image color, undulating and flexing as it raced at them through open space. Its aurora borealis colors were chaotic, its luster blinding, and its electrical nature obvious as it crackled across the huge screen. The fireworks blazed across their faces and ran amok on their fears. It was a thing utterly alien and struck panic in all their hearts. It looked like fire, like electricity, like the face of hell itself.
After some searching, they're able to find the entity out in space that must have been causing all of these problems. When it is revealed, Deanna freaks out, and she pleads with Picard to run away, but the entity starts gaining on them.
1 billion tiny firecrackers erupted across the heavy-duty shielding. Electrokinetic jolts fanned through the ship, through every person's body, through every bone and nerve, every circuit, every conduit, every skin hair, and crackled through every inch of stuff, living or mechanical.
Tasha fires phasers at it, trying to slow it down, but then it releases an attack on the Enterprise. Deanna is crushed by the minds of the spirits, seemingly millions of them coming at her, leaving her in pain and agony. Unable to handle it, she falls to the ground in pain. At the same time, Data is also attacked by the sparks filling the bridge and is slammed against the console.
Riker was trying to reach Troy when the chair beside him moved abruptly, and Data was dragged out of it and thrown across the ops console on his back, and mauled by the electrical pistol whipping. The ship shuddered one more time before the silvery blitz dropped away from its attack on the whole bridge, and converged to a single point from all over the bridge and settled on Data, wrapping around him in his ops console and effervescing there.
Turns out the entity was sucking energy out of the Enterprise, bolstering itself up. Luckily, the Enterprise had its shields up, otherwise the ship probably would have been destroyed. They surmise the entity must be existing between dimensions because the entity is releasing energy and it's dissipating into nothingness, going nowhere, so they think it might be pushing the energy out into a different plane of existence. Deanna explains to Picard that she is feeling perceptions of self, which could be interpreted as souls. A new issue appears then. If there are souls within the entity, what would it mean to attack it? Picard decides that it may be best to separate the ship once again. In case they get hit with the energy field, it won't cost the lives of the families on board. Crazy that they want to separate the ship right after encounter at Farpoint. Just funny to me. Riker immediately pushes back against this idea because he's worried the entity will just detect them in the process and attack the saucer section anyway. So there's a snippet of internal dialogue with Riker watching Picard where he kind of has this worry about Picard's mentality towards this, and it's actually kind of a cool read.
Riker watched the saucer section drift away, mesmerized. Wasn't so bad. Let's hope everything else goes that well. When he could pull his attention away from the sheer beauty of the saucer, he looked at the captain. If he'd ever seen Jean-Luc Picard vacillate, now was the time. The captain looked as though he might suddenly call the disc back into place, gather all his charges beneath his robe. For several seconds, Riker expected to have to give that order, even figured out what words he would use to keep the captain from looking too foolish. But Picard said nothing. In his silence, he bore out the courage of his conviction.
Well, anyway, it was a bad idea because the entity senses the saucer section and immediately starts flying towards it. Picard quickly orders Geordi to fly through the entity and then quickly duck into an asteroid field to distract it from the saucer section. Everyone is shocked by this because they could die, but Picard orders it anyway. The whole crew is attacked by crackling sparks of lightning flying through the battle bridge. Picard is able to speak and orders engineering to dump their ship's antimatter and for Geordi to pivot through that asteroid field. The maneuver works and they break away from the entity. The bridge is still getting rocked by the remaining electricity. Sadly, Data gets fucked once again.
Now it whistled around the bridge with a kind of finality, drew its vortex into a knot and latched onto Data as though sucked there. It hit him with a stiff hand, knocking him right out of his chair. For every volt of electricity the others were now suddenly spared, Data had to take up the slack. He was dragged sideways and driven backward against the bridge rail until the force could push him no farther.
Riker believes that Data can communicate with the entity while he is getting engulfed by the sparks. Data can't seem to speak, but Deanna suddenly speaks very cryptically, as if she is being possessed by the minds of those inside the entity. Once Data is released, he and Deanna collapse. While Data and Deanna recover, Picard decides to return to the saucer section and reconnect, but stay put. The entity disappears entirely, confirming that it is interdimensional. The entity is waiting for the Enterprise to use enough energy to become detectable. Riker questions Data on his experience, and Data confirms that the entity was created and not a natural phenomenon. It also intends to destroy the Enterprise and leave nothing behind. Data confirms that the entity has absorbed people and are essentially still alive within it. Then Data disparages himself in front of Riker. Side note, I haven't mentioned it too much, but throughout the book, Riker has been an incredible dick to Data, and Data has been feeling really shitty about himself because of it. So this is the culmination of Riker's bullying to Data. Data thinks that if he takes a shuttlecraft out to the entity, he may be able to communicate with it. Riker disagrees and tries to apologize for Data for how he's been treating him, but Data is too solemn to listen to him. Meanwhile, Deanna takes Picard aside to tell him everything she knows. Deanna has been feeling the millions of souls within the entity, telling her to let them die.
Troy's lovely eyes took on a bitter anger. I can't make it clear enough, sir, that these people are still alive. They're not supernatural. They're living creatures, many of whom are, or were, human as much as you are human. They have truly achieved immortality. They are still conscious and self-aware. All right, Picard told her. I understand that. What do they want? She clamped her hands into two tight balls, the skin thinning over her knuckles, and turned icy white. They want you to help them die.
At the same time, Data and Geordi are looking to turn off some sort of power reading they got in the reserve tank. But they discover a stowed-away Wesley working on a phaser project. They reprimand him, throw away the project, and put him on his way. And Geordi and Data have another moment where Data is feeling bad about himself. Data suddenly takes Geordi's comm badge and brings up a wall to separate them, trapping Geordi in another room. Data explains that he is going to take a shuttlecraft and go out to the entity. Geordi pleads with him not to go, but Data leaves him behind. In the ready room, Picard, Deanna, Riker, and Beverly discuss the semantics of killing the entity. Would it be murder? Would it be genocide? Deanna shares the feelings that she's been experiencing from the entity, but Riker questions if every life within it is truly asking for death. Would they be ending suffering or committing a mass murder? Beverly sides with Deanna in the matter. Back to my boy, Data enters the shuttlecraft bay and begins creating a cloaking device for a small shuttle. They also have a paragraph here about Data and his eternal feelings, and it's really cool.
Time was limited, yet he was hesitating. Never before had he found himself literally at odds with himself, literally battling his own body to make it do what his programming, his conscious, had always considered wrong. Deception, disobedience. It was not in his program, in his nature.
Back to the ready room. The four of them are still arguing about what to do, and Riker brings up the point that it would violate the Prime Directive. But Beverly has a really interesting point about this.
Not necessarily, Crusher pressed on. Her tone had a defensive sting, and she turned a cold shoulder to him and spoke to the captain instead. When we cured pneumonia and TB, we altered evolution forever. Countless millions who were weak and meant to die simply didn't anymore. When glasses were invented, all the millions of nearsighted people would have been functionally blind in an earlier century suddenly were completely normal. They not only lived, but prospered, mated, and had more nearsighted children. Mankind's been circumventing natural selection for so long that it's become immoral not to. There's your precedent, Captain. I don't believe the question is whether or not to interfere.
Riker still doesn't believe in Deanna and Beverly and argues that it would just be murder. Beverly snaps at Riker, and Deanna generally just cries that Riker is basically yelling at her that she's wrong. Deanna eventually jumps up and says that the millions trapped within the entity can't communicate with each other, so they're conscious but alone, just with their own internal monologue, probably driving them insane. So, Picard, the realist, asked Beverly to put him in some sort of simulation to simulate what those entity spirits must be feeling. He will be paralyzed, in darkness, completely alone with his thoughts. We join Geordi again, still trapped. He's trying to open a panel on the wall, and there's this little section about what's going on.
His hands started to sweat. The going got slower as his fingers began to tremble and slip. Only the microfilters in his visor kept him from making twice as many errors as he was already making, and only his dogged reliance on the occasional snide remark kept him from admitting that he was plain scared.
Floating around, uncontrollably thinking about everything in his past. Meanwhile, Riker is pacing the bridge when Geordi reappears. He explained Data's He explains Data's plan and really spits it at Riker with some venom. With Data essentially cloaked from the sensors, they are not able to beam him on board, so Geordi puts himself up to go and get him so they can be beamed back. But Riker, taking responsibility for all of the bad things he's done, decides that he will go do it instead. Data and Beverly converse while waiting outside the isolation chamber, discussing Will's strong opposition to Deanna's pleas with Picard, which hurt her very deeply. They talk about Deanna and Will's relationship, and it's kind of sweet, and they explore some history between them. They also discuss part of Riker's job as the first officer is to explore all the avenues for the captain, thus why he'd be taking such a strong stance against Deanna, so she shouldn't take it that personally. Actually, Geordi rushes into the room and tries to tell them to pull Picard out because a bunch of shit is going wrong. They're finally able to wake Picard up after 2 hours. He is initially incredibly angry because he believes they left him in there way longer than he actually was in there, but they still left him in there for 14 hours, which is a long time. That's more than half a day. And also, aren't they on a bit of a time crunch, or at least super worried about what's going to happen to them? A little odd. So Riker's out on a dinghy looking for Data, pleading on the open channel for him to come back. Data finally responds after a few minutes. Data arms the weapons on the shuttle and the entity reappears, flying towards him with intense speed. Data is consumed by the cloud, but with the shuttlecraft revealed, Data is able to be beamed on board with Riker. Worf and Tasha deduce that the entity can be overloaded with energy, possibly busting it open like a bubble. The only issue is that the phasers on the Enterprise do not have enough energy to do that. However, this is the exact thing that Wesley was working on earlier when they found him hiding. He was working on a phaser device that would increase the output. With the Enterprise best engineers led by Wesley, they start working on an amplifier. The crew waits uncomfortably, knowing that this is their one and only shot, but right before the amplifier is ready, the entity begins to charge. But of course, just in time, they shoot off as much power as possible, and luckily, it destroys the entity. It bursts into a display of swirling sparks, the crew is saved, but the phaser core is completely fused together because of this. Geordi reflects at his station about the loss of Data, what the definition of his life may have been. He ponders whether there'll be some sort of funeral and what they might say at it. But then... He spun out of his chair and knocked the helm console aside. Data! Data caught his arm and kept him from tripping over the ops lounge, and kept grinning that warm little grin. Data! Geordi gasped again, clasping Data's cool hand and looking deeply into the android's eyes to see if it was indeed Data, and not just some weird new science nobody had told him about that could make the body walk around. Hello, friend, Data said, humility touching his tone. I'm sorry to have put you through this. Geordi squeezed Data's hand with both of his, desperate to feel the essence of life that simply refused to showcase itself, but he couldn't think of anything to say. Once the entity was destroyed, the souls of all those trapped inside suddenly went everywhere. So Data was able to return to his body. Riker, Data, and Wesley wait in the Red Room to be reprimanded by Picard for all of the crazy shit that they did. Sweetly, though, Picard immediately dismisses them, more or less trying to just move on from the whole thing, since everyone did something pretty wacky. But as they exit, the spirits of the Russian aircraft carrier are on the bridge, visible to everybody, and they salute Picard, who salutes back. And that is the end of the book. I think this book does a good job of giving everyone a moment to shine, except for Worf and Tasha, which is kind of a bummer because they're great characters, but I'm not mad at it. They didn't really have a lot to do. They still have, like, dialogue in the book. Tasha way more than Worf. I think Worf says, like, 2 things in the whole book, though. Okay, one little quick note from this bad boy. So I believe part of the reason that Riker and Data have the relationship they have is from this little bit of this book. Riker also has some difficulty in accepting Lieutenant Commander Data as a crewman equal. A very interesting aspect is the fact that Data has needs, not unlike that of a female crew person.
In other words, Data needs to very much be needed. In short, Data needs Riker to like him too.
This might be why Riker was written to be kind of a dick to Data, but I'm not quite sure, because in Encounter at Farpoint, Riker is kind of in awe of Data, more or less. He seems to be kind of impressed by him, but that's the only kind of thing I gleaned from that. Okay, now we're gonna get into my thoughts and feelings. Burp. The good! I really enjoyed Wesley in this book. I think they did a very good job of making him feel like a teenager, but also making him feel like a genius. I like that he saved the day in the end. I thought it was just kind of a nice moment for him to shine for what his character is supposed to be. Riker is a huge dick to Data, as I mentioned many times, but there's this scene that I really enjoy between them.
I don't know what you are, I admit that, he told Data with a vocal shrug. I'm not qualified to say, but Starfleet checked you out and you tested out alive, and that's good enough by machines, sir, Data reminded painfully. Machines will report whatever they are told to report. No human looks at me and thinks I am human too. And you, more than anyone, still treats me like a machine. Until his chest started hurting, Riker didn't even inhale. What had he been thinking about? Admitting the truth? What happens when it slams you across the face and insists you look? Sir, Data began, solemn again. If I may go now. Sadly, Riker leaned on the command chair and nodded. Dismissed.
The great! I love Data in this book. Data is wonderful. They wrote some really nice comedic relief scenes with him that I think work really well. They're very funny, to me at least. And he just has feelings in this book. Just has feelings. No way around it. He just has emotions in this book. I also love Geordi in this book. There's a very sweet moment where he's waxing poetic about the way Data looks to him through the visor. It's very sweet.
But Data was a work of art. Geordi alone could see the exotic materials, brilliantly blended, the different levels of heat and coolness, the different densities where metal met synthetic, where synthetic met organism, were all meshed. He saw the density of Data's body, and all the million tiny electrical impulses that kept him working and ran like swarms of insects through his body when he worked a little harder or concentrated a little more or called up more strength. But it wasn't like looking at the computer stations before them, or the mechanism behind the wall at the coffee and food dispenser. Not at all. Those were machines. LaForge sometimes got the feeling that people forgot he could hear, too. He had listened to Riker's tone just before the first officer left the bridge. He had heard the flutter in Data's voice when he mentioned that Riker wasn't too pleased with him. Data was mechanical, but to Geordi LaForge he was no machine. Geordi allowed himself an indulgent gaze at Data's face as the android glowed with concentration.
I personally think that it's kind of a cute little look into the relationship in this book, how close they are, or at least how much Geordi cares about Data and tries to express that to him. In the show, I know that they're best friends, but we don't get as many emotional scenes between them like this book. And I think that it's a sweet platonic relationship between them. It could be gay, but I'm going to choose to not let it be gay in this example. But it really could be. They might be in love. Here's a couple of examples of the cute comic relief that Data is giving through the book.
She's a very competent broad, Data offered. So innocuous. So deadpan. Riker stopped breathing. Picard glowered. LaForge and Worth both stiffened in place. Tasha flushed and Bev Crusher looked away. Data sat in a pool of perpetual good intentions. His chair swiveled ever so slightly towards the rest of them, and as all eyes crawled to him with that collective reprimand, his expression became confused. He glanced from each to the others. Chick? Dish? The turbolift doors brushed open. A preoccupied ship's counselor stepped in. Bird? Bun? Babe? Skirt?
And then Riker is a dick. There's a very cool moment where Riker reflects about his position as the second in command on the bridge, and I really enjoyed it.
Next selection. First officer on parade. But worse. If the first officer appeared indifferent, wasn't that worse? There was no middle ground, or at least Riker hadn't found it. He wanted to be a bulwark, but not one the captain had to climb over. It was tiring, pretending to be completely one with a commanding officer whom he simply didn't know very well on a personal basis. Yet they faced the prospect of sharing the next few years at each other's side. Could that be done on the plane of informality that had set itself up between them? Riker tried to pace the bridge casually, yet without appearing aimless. That was the tricky part.
The bad. William T. Riker is an absolute asshole and notable space racist. He is constantly a downright bastard in this book to Data and Geordi. He's deeply annoyed that Data exists in the same room as him, and he comes around, of course, but he is so awful before that.
Riker turned aft in time to see a slender humanoid straighten at the science post. The face was still startling, its doll-like pyrite sheen softened by only its sculptured expression. Data's expression, when there was one, always carried a childlike naivete that eased the severness of his slick-back hair and the cartoon colors of his skin. For the 100th time, Riker involuntarily wondered why anybody smart enough to create an android so intricate was too stupid to paint its face the right color, or put some tone on its lips. If his builders filled it with a human data, pardon the pun, somewhere in the download must have been information that the palette of human skin types didn't include chrome. It was as though they went out of their way to shape him like a human, and then went even further out of their way to paste him with signs that said, "Hey, I'm an android."
When Deanna's in her quarters and Riker comes to check in on her, there is this moment right here.
She knew people were uncomfortable around her because they thought of her as some kind of voyeur, always peeking through the keyholes of their thoughts. Mind-slut, some called her. Many avoided her, so she had always tried to be more businesslike and stoic about her extremely unbusinesslike talent, and even that practice had backfired. Cold, they called her. An unfeeling mind-slut.
In the context of the show, this feels wrong because, what? I had never thought of what an insult to the Betazoids would be, but, not this. I wouldn't say I dislike Picard in this book. I like Picard in this book, but he doesn't seem very warm in this whole book. The only time where he seems kind of chill is at the very end when he lets everyone off the hook. But otherwise, he just seems kind of pissed off the whole time. But he might just be trying to put on a facade in front of everyone, since he doesn't know everybody yet. But still. This is a small nitpick, but I hate this line.
She looked at him with eyes that wanted everything to be all right, and she seemed as innocent and hopeful as a Disney drawing.
Versus the show. When comparing the book to the show, the book is absolute nonsense. The entity having to do with souls or spirits feels a little too out there for Star Trek, specifically TNG, but I don't know. Having an entity is straight out of the show, so I don't have a problem with that. Just the ghost part of it. So like I mentioned before, the book confirms that Data has a soul. Straight up. This is, 2 years before Measure of a Man came out, which doesn't really discuss him having, a soul. So, just a crazy thing to just put in the first book of the series. Super crazy thing to put in. Riker is a complete flop in this book. As I mentioned, all of the other things that he did, his behavior, his demeanor, his personality, little reason given to this, but I doubt that Data would become so annoying to Riker this quickly for him to act this way. There's also this description in the writer's guide.
A very interesting aspect is the fact that Data has needs, not unlike that of a female crew person. In other words, Data needs to very much be needed.
This is also a weird description of Data, by the way. I don't really understand this, and kind of strange. Small nitpick, but Tasha background was initially going to be Ukrainian. Reference to Star Trek Where No One Has Gone Before, A History in Pictures. Later down the line, they have that switched a little bit. She still has a Ukrainian background, but is from Turkana 4. In this book, though, they mention that she has a Lithuanian background. Little nitpick, just a little discrepancy, that's all. In this book, Deanna refers to Riker as Bill multiple times. The only time that I ever remember this in the show is in The Naked Now. Don't remember it happening any other time past then, but it is also mentioned in the writer's guide that Deanna calls Riker Bill. So there's that. Another thing that I think points to the writers getting this writer's guide. Like before, when Beverly discusses Geordi's sight, there's a paragraph during her argument with Picard where she describes what it may be like for Geordi if he were to get eye implants. If this is true, I guess the implies that between the series and the films, Geordi must have done some crazy fast therapy for those eye implants. I do enjoy the description though, it's very cool. All in all, I really enjoyed this book. I kind of loved it, actually. Even with Riker as more of a bastard in this book than he really is in the show, I think it was wonderfully written, I think it was interesting, and I think it was really fun. Especially if you love these characters. Of course, there's some strange moments before they all feel like how they feel later in the show. Still absolutely fun adventure. So for right now, book number 1 is at the number 1 spot, because it is the only book I've reviewed so far, so there you go. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that somebody got some enjoyment out of this. I'd like to make the second video soon for the Peacekeepers. I'll probably have to reread it though. It's been a while, so hopefully that will come out next month, because this one's coming out this month for Halloween. So, thanks for watching. Kay out. Okay, so this just came, so I'm gonna try it on, and hopefully it'll fit, and I'll see how it looks. Oh! Okay. It doesn't smell like a costume, so. Oh, this is definitely a men's size. Oh, it looks great! Oh, it's great. Yeah, this is gonna be tall and weird on me, so we'll see how it goes. I look awesome.